The train arrived 12 minutes late in Larkspur, Colorado territory. February of 1883, 12 minutes meant nothing to most men. The mountains did not care about schedules. The cattle did not care about schedules. The wind that came screaming down from the Rockies every morning before dawn did not care about anything at all. But on this particular Tuesday, on this particular platform, three men had been standing in the cold for going on 40 minutes, and not one of them had moved an inch. Everett Cole stood at the far left end of the platform, arms crossed over his chest, hat pulled low against the February bite. He was 30 years old, built like a man who had spent a decade doing things most men only read about in dime novels. Not wide for show, but wide the way a load-bearing wall is wide, useful, and permanent, and not going anywhere. His jaw was set. His gray-green eyes were fixed on the eastern curve of the tracks where the train would appear. He had not spoken since he arrived at the depot. He had not needed to. Everything Everett Cole needed to communicate, he communicated through the fact of his presence. And his presence on this platform on this morning was a complete and unambiguous statement. Calhoun Holt stood 20 feet to Everett's right, and the distance between them was not accidental. Cal was the same age, give or take a month, but where Everett was still, Cal moved, shifting his weight from boot to boot, rolling his shoulders, touching the brim of his hat, only to push it back again moments later. His dark eyes were restless in the way that dark eyes are restless when they are keeping watch over too many things at once. His hands, big and scarred from years of ranch work and one brutal campaign in the Arizona territory 4 years prior, opened and closed at his sides, like a man trying to decide whether to make a fist or let go of something he had been gripping for longer than was good for him. Aldous Wyndham stood between them, closer to the center of the platform, and he was the only one who appeared to a casual observer to be doing anything resembling relaxing. His wool coat was brushed clean. His boots were as polished as a man could manage on a Colorado morning. He held a single folded piece of paper in his left hand, a newspaper clipping, and though he was not reading it, he had not put it away. He had carried it for 3 weeks. He saw no reason to stop now. The clipping had been his reason for getting out of bed on the mornings when getting out of bed had required a reason, and he was not prepared to fold it away until the thing it represented was standing in front of him. The station master, a barrel-chested man named Douglas Pruitt, who had been running the Larkspur Depot for 19 years, watched the three men from the doorway of his office and felt something he could not quite name. He had seen reunions on this platform. He had seen men come home from wars and women arrive as strangers who would become wives. He had seen grief and joy and the ordinary magnificent traffic of frontier life pass through this small square of weathered boards for nearly 2 decades. He had never seen anything quite like this. He knew all three of them. Everyone in Larkspur knew Everett Cole. The man had worn a U.S. Marshal's badge for 8 years before hanging it up 2 seasons ago to focus full attention on his ranch. Everyone knew Cal Holt, who had come back from the Apache campaign in 1879, quieter than he'd left, and twice as hard, and had not in the 4 years since done anything to reverse either condition. And everyone knew Aldous Wyndham, the Englishman, who had arrived in Colorado 7 years ago with a crate of books and a jaw set with a determination that had struck most locals as either admirable or insane, and who had since built a working cattle operation through sheer force of will and an educated man's principled refusal to make the same mistake twice. What Douglas Pruitt did not know, what he could not have known, was why all three of them were standing on his platform at the same time on the same Tuesday morning, waiting for the same eastbound train. He suspected it had something to do with a woman. He was right. The whistle sounded first. Then the smoke appeared above the tree line to the east at a dark column rising and bending in the February wind like a signal. Then the train itself came around the curve iron and steam and the grinding complaint of brakes being applied, and the platform came alive with the small movements of people preparing themselves for arrival. Everett did not move. Cal stopped moving. Aldous folded the newspaper clipping and put it in his breast pocket close to his chest, where it had lived for 3 weeks and would stay a while longer. The train slowed. It groaned, it stopped, doors opened, people descended, a family with too much luggage and not enough of hands, a salesman in a city coat already regretting his destination, 2 ranch hands returning from somewhere they probably should not have been and smart enough not to discuss it, an older woman with a hat that had not survived the journey particularly well, and then Clara Mae Weston stepped down onto the platform at Larkspur, Colorado territory, and the world for three men who had been waiting 6 years for this exact moment went very quiet. She was 24 years old. So many times that the mending itself had become a kind of art, small, neat stitches at the collar and cuffs that spoke of a woman who did not have the money to replace things, but had the skill and the patience to preserve them. Her hair was the color of autumn wheat pinned up under a small hat that was clean and straight despite the long journey from Boston. She was not tall. She was not the kind of woman who stopped a room by walking into it, not in the way that caused men to forget their manners or lose track of their names. She stopped this platform by simply standing on it, by being here, by being real after 6 years of being only a memory that three men had kept burning against considerable odds. Her eyes brown steady and carrying 6 years of a life that had not been particularly kind moved across the crowd with the careful economy of a woman who had learned to assess situations quickly. A woman who had been put in enough difficult rooms to understand that reading them fast was a survival skill, not a social one. Those eyes found Everett Cole first. He had not moved. He was still standing at the left end of the platform, with his arms crossed and his hat low, and he was looking at her the way a man looks at something he has been searching for in the dark for a very long time, and has finally, after all the searching, finally found. There was nothing restrained about it. Everett Cole was a restrained man in almost every particular, but the look on his face in that moment was not restrained. It was just true. Clara's breath caught. She looked right. She found Cal Holt, who was no longer shifting his weight or rolling his shoulders or doing any of the restless things he did when he was trying to contain something he had never been particularly good at containing. He was perfectly still for the first time in years, his dark eyes locked onto her face with an intensity that she felt across 20 feet of cold Colorado air, like a hand pressing flat against her sternum. Her carpetbag handle creaked in her grip. She looked to the center of the platform and found Aldous Wyndham, who was watching her with hazel eyes that were calm and warm, and just slightly too knowing, the eyes of a man who had spent 3 weeks constructing careful arguments for why he was prepared for this moment and was now in the first second of it, discovering that the arguments had not held. Douglas Pruitt, who had drifted closer to the scene despite himself, counted the seconds of silence that followed. He got to 7 before Clara Weston said very quietly to no one in particular, and to all three of them at once, "All three of you." It was not a question. Everett moved first. He always had. It was something in the architecture of him, the same quality that had made him effective at his job for 8 years, the same thing that drove him out of bed before sunrise every morning to check on his cattle in the dark. When something needed to be done, Everett Cole did not audit the situation or wait for better conditions. He moved. He crossed the platform in a dozen strides and stopped in front of Clara with 3 feet of space between them, close enough to see the exhaustion in her face, and the thing underneath the exhaustion that was not exhaustion at all, that was relief and grief and recognition, all tangled together in a way that made his chest feel like something was slowly, steadily compressing it. Clara. His voice was lower than it had been 6 years ago, rougher around the edges. 6 winters of cold mornings and hard work had done that, and he was not sorry for it. She looked up at him. She had forgotten how tall he was, or perhaps she had remembered it incorrectly, softened the memory without meaning to. "Everett," she said. One word. His name. 6 years contained in 2 syllables. Cal reached them before Aldous did, which surprised no one who knew him. He came to a stop just to Clara's right, close enough that she would have felt the heat of him through the cold air, and the look on his face was something that a man like Cal Holt, a man who had ridden into hostile country with 40 soldiers and come back with 33, a man who had survived things that left marks that didn't show from the outside, had no business wearing on a public train platform. Raw and open and desperately certain all at once. "Tell me you remember us," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "I remember everything," Clara said. She said it simply, without performance, and that simplicity made it more true than any larger declaration could have been. Aldous arrived last, as he usually did. He had learned a long time ago in a different country where arriving last had different social implications. That arriving last meant arriving with information, time to observe, time to understand the shape of a thing before having to speak into it. He stopped in front of Clara and looked at her with his careful hazel eyes, and said in the British accent that 6 years in Colorado had softened considerably, but had not erased, "We never forgot you," not one day of it. Douglas Pruitt cleared his throat with the self-consciousness of a man who has drifted into someone else's private moment and is now unsure how to extract himself. "Well," he said, "I see this isn't quite the mix-up I was starting to think it was." "No mix-up," Everett said without looking away from Clara. "We all responded to her advertisement. We all knew exactly who we were writing to." Clara looked between the three men. The cold was biting through her mended coat. People on the platform were pretending not to stare with varying degrees of success. She had spent 3 weeks on trains and in railway stations, in cold waiting rooms, preparing for this moment, and still she was not prepared. Some moments could not be prepared for. They could only be entered. "You all answered," she said, "the same advertisement. All three of you." "The moment I saw your name," Cal said low and direct, "I stopped reading and started writing back." "I read it 3 times, Aldous said, to be certain I was not imagining it. Then I wrote before I finished my coffee." Everett said nothing. He had written his letter in a single sitting without revision and sent it before he could argue himself out of it. That was the entirety of the story as far as he was concerned, and it needed no elaboration. "I thought—" Clara stopped, began again. "I thought you had all moved on. Dottie told me no one wrote. She said men like you—" "Dorothy Crane," Everett said, and something shifted in his voice, a specific hardness entering it. The former marshal's controlled anger at knowing what a person has done and not yet having the evidence to prove it. "She said we didn't write." "She returned every letter," Aldous said quietly. "We wrote, Clara. All three of us. More letters than I care to count precisely. They came back unopened. Every one of them." The revelation landed on Clara the way heavy things land when you have been bracing for them without knowing what you were bracing for. She had sensed it somewhere underneath the surface of 6 years, the strange absence of response from three men who had looked at her the way these men had looked at her. She had explained it to herself with the logic of a girl who had been told repeatedly that she was not the kind of thing worth waiting for. People moved on. 6 years was a long time. Hard men in a hard country did not spend their years pining over a girl who'd been taken away. She had been wrong about that. She had been wrong about most of what Dorothy had told her it was beginning to seem. "She lied to me," Clara said. "Yes," said Everett. One word flat and final. It contained everything he knew and everything he suspected in a quantity of controlled fury that he was keeping behind a door for the moment, and it was enough. Mrs. Lenora Greer arrived on the platform with the practicality of a woman who had seen the telegram come in 2 days earlier and had been making preparations since. She was 61 years old, had outlasted 2 husbands, and one catastrophic winter that had taken a third of the valley's livestock, and she ran the cleanest boarding house between Denver and the Utah border with the quiet, unquestioned authority of a woman who had decided somewhere around her 40th year that she was done tolerating nonsense in any of its varieties. "Miss Weston." She extended her hand. Her grip was firm. "Lenora Greer, I have a room ready and tea on the stove. You look like you need both." "I need both very much," Clara agreed. The three men looked at each other over Clara's head. A negotiation happened in that look, the kind of negotiation conducted entirely without words because words would require someone to concede something they were not ready to concede. The result was a temporary and genuinely fragile peace. "She'll need time to settle in properly," Aldous said. "We'll come by in the morning," Everett said. It did not come out as a question because with Everett Cole, it rarely did. Cal looked at Clara, directly bypassing the diplomatic preamble. "I'll be there at 8. 9, said Aldous. 8, said Everett. Clara looked at all three of them in turn and felt something ease in her chest that had been wound tight since before Boston, if she was being honest with herself since the morning 6 years ago, when she had watched Larkspur disappear behind the wagon and understood for the first time in her young life that she had no say in what was happening to her. 8 o'clock, she said. All three of you, together. We'll talk properly then. The men accepted this, not with any grace. There was nothing graceful about three men accepting shared terms for access to a woman. Each of them had been waiting 6 years for, but they accepted it, which was the thing that mattered. Lenora steered Clara off the platform with a firm hand and a look directed back at the three men that communicated without any ambiguity whatsoever that following was not an available option. They did not follow. They stood on the platform in the February cold and watched her go, and not one of them looked at the others for a long time. The room Lenora gave her was small and clean and warm, which made it three things better than the room Clara had occupied in Boston for most of the past 6 years. There was a quilt on the bed, blue and white, worn to a comfortable softness, and a window that looked west toward the mountains. Clara stood at that window for a long time after the tea had gone cold on the nightstand. The mountains were exactly as she remembered them. That was the particular cruelty and mercy of returning to a place you had loved and lost and thought about every day, without exception, for 6 years. The place did not change. The mountains were still there. The sky was still enormous in the way that eastern skies never managed to be. The specific quality of late afternoon winter light on snow-covered peaks was still something that no quantity of Boston gray had managed to crowd out of her memory, because she had never once let herself forget it. She had thought of it constantly, in fact. In the cold boarding house room where she had lived since Dorothy had deposited her with a distant acquaintance and departed with the brisk satisfaction of a woman who had discharged a duty. In the seamstress shop where she had worked 6 days of every week for wages that covered her food and her room and nothing else that gave her survival without anything that resembled living. In the small and persistent dream she had carried for 6 years, like a coin worn smooth from handling the dream of coming back of the mountains of three men who had looked at her like she was the only woman in the world, who she had told herself over and over, had certainly reasonably moved on with their lives. They had not moved on. She turned from the window and sat on the edge of the bed and let herself, for the first time since the train had left Denver, feel the full weight of what Dorothy's lie had cost her. 6 years. She had been 18 years old when her father died. 3 days of winter illness, moving too fast to fight and too sudden to make any kind of peace with. And then Thomas Weston was gone, and Dorothy Crane had materialized from her life in the East, like a woman who had been waiting off stage for precisely this cue. Clara had been young enough and grief-struck enough and legally orphaned enough that she had not understood in those first terrible days that she had options, that she could have said no, that three men in their mid-20s with working ranches and solid standing in the community had in fact offered to marry her immediately, had gone to that wagon, all three of them, and asked Dorothy to let her stay. Dorothy had refused. She had cited Clara's youth and her grief and her need for family. She had put her in the wagon and taken her to the station and taken her east, and on the train she had placed a hand over Clara's and said in a tone of comfortable certainty, "Those boys will forget you by spring, dear. Men like that always do." Clara had believed her. She had been 18 and grieving and entirely without leverage, and she had believed her. Sitting on the edge of the bed with the cold tea and the mountains outside the window, Clara Mae Weston permitted herself one full minute to grieve what those 6 years had contained and what they had cost. Then she set it aside. She was here now. That was the thing that mattered. She was here, and so were they, and whatever came next was going to be decided on her terms. A knock at the door. Lenora entered without waiting for an answer, which Clara suspected was standard practice, and found she did not mind. "You should sleep," Lenora said, "but there's something you need to know first, before those men arrive in the morning." She sat in the chair by the window and folded her hands in her lap with the posture of a woman who has decided that directness is the kindest available option. "Your father's land," Lenora said. "Do you know what has been happening with it?" The cold came into the room, though the window was closed. "Dorothy manages it." "Dorothy has been managing it," Lenora said carefully, "for 6 years. And for the last 4 months she has been in correspondence with the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad." The silence that followed had a specific quality. "She's selling it," Clara said. "She is attempting to finalize a sale," Lenora said. "The negotiations are at their final stage. The contract, and I know this because in a town this size, information does not remain private for long, is set to be concluded in 60 days. 60 days. Thomas Weston's land. 340 acres of Colorado territory that sat in the direct path of a railroad expansion that everyone in the region had been watching develop for the past 2 years. Land that was worth more money than Clara had made in 6 years of seamstress work. Land that Dorothy Crane, by any reasonable interpretation of the law, had no authority to sell. "She has no right to it," Clara said. Her voice was level in the way that voices are level when the person speaking them is working very hard. "That is a question for a lawyer," Lenora said, "and it is a question that needs answering quickly. 60 days is not a generous window. Aldous Wyndham, Clara said after a moment, he studied law before he came west. Before he came west, yes. 3 years at an inn of court in London, from what I understand. Lenora rose. Sleep, Miss Weston. Tomorrow will be a full day. It was not a suggestion. Clara recognized it as such and found she was grateful for it. They arrived at 8 o'clock. All three of them, which was perhaps not surprising, but was nonetheless something to observe. Everett was first through the door by perhaps 30 seconds. Cal arrived immediately after, and the look that passed between them as Cal came into the parlor was the particular look exchanged between men who have known each other for years, in the specific way of people who are not quite friends, but who have been each other's most consistent competition, who understand each other with the precision that comes from having wanted the same thing for a long time and having watched the other man want it too. Aldous arrived last and carried himself with the ease of a man who had decided that being last was a strategic position rather than a failure. Clara came downstairs in her second-best dress, dark green wool, her best being preserved for a more formal occasion with her hair properly done and her hands steady. She had lain awake constructing this conversation for most of the night, and she was ready to have it. She looked at the three men in Lenora's parlor and felt all at once the full complexity of what she was dealing with. Three men. Three good men she had known that at 18 in the 6 years had not changed it. Three men who had built lives in this territory, worked hard, and kept their word, and waited for a woman they had been told explicitly to forget. "Sit down," she said. They sat. "I'm going to say several things," Clara said. "I need each of you to listen completely before anyone speaks. Can you do that?" Three nods. Cal's came last, and with the slight delay of a man whose instinct is always to act rather than listen, making a deliberate choice to override it. "I came here as a mail-order bride," she said. "That is the truth of what I am. I am not the girl you knew at 18, and you are not the young men you were then. We are strangers who have a shared history, and that is a more complicated thing to be than either strangers or old friends." She let that settle. "I will not make decisions based on memory. Memory is not a foundation. I need to know who you are now." She let the words stand. "I am proposing 1 month," she said, 4 weeks. "I will visit each of your ranches. I will see how you work and what you have built and who you have become in the time I was away. At the end of that month, I will give you my decision." She paused. "That decision will be final and it will be respected by all three of you. I need that understood before anything else." "Understood," said Aldous immediately. "Yes," said Everett. Cal held her eyes for a moment. The tightly wound thing in him, the thing that was always close to the surface, that had always been the most visible thing about him, moved across his face. Then, "Agreed, but there is something I need you to know, Clara, before we proceed." "Cal," Everett started. "No." Cal leaned forward, elbows on his knees, dark eyes direct. "She deserves to know this before she agrees to anything. 6 years ago, when Dorothy Crane put you in that wagon, all three of us were there. All three of us asked her to let you stay, offered to marry you immediately if that was what it required. She said no." His jaw tightened. "We were not wrong to want to keep you here. I need to know you understand that." Clara held his gaze for a moment. "I know," she said quietly. "I know you weren't wrong." Something in him eased fractionally. "There is one more matter," Clara said. "Mrs. Greer told me last night about my father's land, about Dorothy and the railroad contract." The room changed immediately. Everett's expression did not shift, but his eyes went very still in the particular way they went still when he was assessing something that required careful handling. Cal straightened. Aldous, who had been the most at ease of the three, became entirely alert. "You know," Everett said. 60 days, Clara confirmed. "Aldous, you studied law before you came here." 3 years at Lincoln's Inn in London," Aldous said. "My father's finances made completing the qualification impossible, but the knowledge is still there. You want me to look at the arrangements?" "I want to understand what my father actually left me," Clara said. "What rights Dorothy actually has. The truth of my situation before I make any decisions about anything else." "I can do that," Aldous said. "I have already written to the county clerk's office in Denver. I expect a response within the week." "We can all help," Everett said, and the way he said it, quiet, definitive, not an offer but a statement of fact, made Clara feel something she chose not to name yet. Good, she said. Then we begin. The first ranch visit was to Everett Coles, which sat 6 miles north of Larkspur, on land that rose gently toward the foothills and caught the afternoon sun in a way that made the snow-covered fields look in certain lights as though someone had painted them rather than grown them. Everett drove the wagon himself and said almost nothing on the journey out, which Clara had expected. He had always been a man who communicated through presence rather than language, through the consistency of showing up, through the quality of the work his hands produced, through the specific quality of attention he directed at the people around him that was more honest than most speech. On the way to his ranch, he pointed out two landmarks, without commentary: a ridge where he'd taken shelter during the blizzard of 1881 and the creek crossing that flooded every spring, in which he'd spent 2 summers building up with stone to manage it. Neither observation required a response. Both told her something. The ranch itself was larger than she had imagined. Not extravagant, there was nothing extravagant in Everett Cole's nature, but substantial in the way that things built carefully over time by a person who intends them to last are substantial. A main house of timber and stone that had been expanded twice since its original footprint. A barn maintained with the obsessive consistency of a man who understood that a well-kept barn was the first indicator of everything else about a ranch. A bunkhouse where two hired hands nodded respectfully as the wagon came in, and then found reasons to be elsewhere with the tact of men who had received specific instructions about this specific afternoon. He led her inside without preamble. It was the room at the back of the house that stopped her. A second bedroom clearly finished within the past year, the timber on the walls still pale with newness, the mortar between the stones not yet fully darkened by seasons of heating and cooling. There were curtains on the window, small white flowers on white cotton, the kind of curtains that had no business in a bachelor's house unless someone had put deliberate thought into them. A writing desk sat against the east wall, positioned with the chair angled to catch the morning light. "You built this," she said. "It had no question in it." "Last spring," and Everett said from the doorway. He did not come into the room. He stood in the frame and looked at it with the expression of a man regarding something that had cost him more than lumber and labor and time. "I built the main room in the first year. The additions after that." He stopped, started again because Everett Cole did not make revisions to what he was going to say. He simply stopped and started again when the first version was not the true one. "I built this room because I kept imagining you here. Every season, every nail I drove, I told myself it was practical that a working homestead should have the space, but that was not why I built it." Clara turned to look at him. "I built it because I never stopped believing you would come back," he said. "I am not asking you to decide anything based on that. I only want you to know it." She looked at the curtains, at the desk in the morning light, at the evidence of 6 years of hope made physical and permanent, made into a room you could stand in. "I know," she said, and she meant considerably more by it than the words themselves contained. He walked her through the rest of the operation, through the afternoon, the livestock management, the irrigation systems. He had worked out over years of watching how the water moved across the particular topography of his land, the hillside cellar built to store enough provisions to carry 4 people through a hard winter without need of resupply. 4 people. He had not said it for effect. That more than anything was what made it land. By the time they drove back to Larkspur in the cooling late afternoon, Clara had a clear and specific picture of who Everett Cole had become. He was not a man who would overwhelm her with declarations or sweep her anywhere. He was a man who would show up every morning without exception with the steady and indestructible reliability of bedrock. She had spent 6 years in a city that had taught her through sustained and unglamorous instruction exactly how rare and valuable that quality was. At the boarding house, Everett helped her down. His hands rested on her waist a moment longer than the assistance strictly required, and when she looked up at him, the late light was behind him, and there was nothing hidden in his face. "Tomorrow is Aldous' day," he said. "Yes." "Clara." He stepped back. His gray-green eyes held hers in the fading February light. "That room has been waiting. This is a real place, a real life. Whatever you decide at the end of the month, I need you to know that." "I know," she said. She went inside. That night, lying in the small, clean room with the mountains dark through the window, she thought about 3 men and what it meant that all 3 had waited. About what 6 years of silence costs a person who is keeping a belief alive against it. And beneath those thoughts, quieter but more insistent, She thought about 60 days and 340 acres, and a woman in Boston who had built her entire strategy on the certainty that Clara Weston would never find her way back. Dorothy Crane had been wrong about the letters. She had been wrong about the men. She had been wrong about what Clara had become in 6 years of a life that had been difficult and stripping, and in the way of difficult stripping, things clarifying. She was about to discover how wrong she had been about everything else. The second ranch visit was Aldous Wyndham's, and it was nothing like the first. Wherever its operation communicated scale and the endurance of a man who had built something large and maintained it through relentless, consistent effort, Aldous told a different story entirely. The place was smaller, set in a shallow valley 3 miles west of Larkspur, where a natural rise on two sides broke the worst of the winter wind. The main cabin was modest in size but precise in its construction, the kind of building that had been thoroughly thought through before a single board was cut. Every angle considered, every joint fitted with a care that most frontier builders reserve for churches and courthouses. Clara noticed the books before anything else. Of course she did. 3 shelves running the full length of the east wall packed with volumes that had clearly been handled many times and carried a great distance. Law texts with broken spines, history and natural science. 2 shelves of literature ranging from Shakespeare to frontier accounts, to a copy of Darwin held together with a strip of rawhide. "You brought all of these from England," she said. "The crate weighed more than everything else I owned combined." Aldous stood in the center of his room, watching her examine his shelves with an expression that was carefully composed and completely transparent to anyone paying attention. The men at the Denver Freight office were convinced I was deranged. Were they wrong? Probably not. A pause. I have never once regretted it, however. He had set a table outside despite the cold, the same instinct toward deliberate civility that Clara had recognized in him 6 years ago, the quality that had always struck her as slightly impractical and quietly beautiful. There was coffee kept hot in a heavy iron pot, bread he had baked that morning, which surprised her, and dried apple preserves that were better than anything she had eaten in Boston in 6 years. They sat outside in the thin winter sunlight with the mountains behind them and talked as Clara had not talked with anyone in years about ideas in the shape of things and what a person owed to the place they chose and the people they chose to love. Aldous asked her questions about Boston that were not the polite, interested questions of a man making conversation, but the real questions of a man who had spent years imagining a life he could not see and now wanted to understand what had been true about it. She told him everything: the boarding house room, the seamstress work, the particular quality of exhaustion that comes from surviving on the wrong side of enough for a long time. He listened without flinching and without the uncomfortable pity she had come to dread from people who asked and then wished they hadn't. He listened the way a person listens when they are storing information because they intend to understand it. "You came through 6 years of something genuinely hard," he said, "and you came back anyway. That is not a small thing." "It felt small," she said. "Most of those 6 years felt very small indeed." "They weren't." He refilled her coffee without asking. "Surviving what diminishes you without allowing yourself to be diminished, that is not small. That is the only thing that matters in the end." She looked at him across the table, at the hazel eyes that saw more than he let on, at the hands rougher than a man who had studied law in London had any reason to expect, at the composed and careful face of someone who had crossed an ocean and built something entirely different from what he'd been raised toward. "My father's will," she said. "How quickly can you determine what it actually says?" "I have already begun," he said. "I wrote to Denver 2 days ago. I expect a response within the week." He paused. "Your father was a careful man. The kind of man who made arrangements in advance precisely because he understood that arrangements made after the fact rarely hold." "You think he anticipated, Dorothy?" "I think he was a father who loved his daughter and was not naive about his wife's sister." He held her gaze. "I think there may be considerably more to this situation than Dorothy has allowed you to know." The February sun was warm on her face, which was a small grace. "Whatever is in that will," she said. "I need it before the 60 days are finished." "You will have it," Aldous said, with the finality of a statement of intent. "I promise you that." The drive back was quieter than the drive with Everett, not the silence of a man with nothing left to say, but the silence of a man who had said the things that mattered and trusted them to carry their own weight without supervision. At the boarding house, he helped her down and held her hand a moment past necessity. "Tomorrow is Cal's day," he said. "I know." His hazel eyes were steady. "He will not be subtle about any of it." "No," she agreed. "He never was." Something near a smile. "That is either his greatest strength or his greatest weakness. Very possibly both in equal measure." He released her hand. "Good night, Clara." She watched him drive away and thought that Aldous Wyndham was one of the most quietly formidable people she had ever encountered. Formidable in the specific way that intelligence combined with patience, combined with genuine feeling, is always formidable. It did not make noise. It simply built things and did not stop. Cal's day came cold and windless, the sky that hard, clear blue Colorado produced in February, as if in deliberate compensation for everything else the month required. He arrived before 8. She had expected that too. He came on horseback rather than wagon a bay gelding that was large and well-muscled, and clearly his first choice in every respect, and he had brought a second horse for her. A calm sorrel mare with a patient eye and a gait that would be easy on a long, cold ride. The fact that he had thought to bring her a horse told her something about how he had spent the previous day preparing. "There's somewhere I need to show you first," he said before she had finished buttoning her coat. "Before the ranch, there's a place." She did not ask where. She mounted the sorrel with the ease of a woman who had grown up on a Colorado ranch and not entirely lost the muscle memory of it, even after 6 years of city sidewalks, and she followed Cal Holt east into the cold, bright morning. After 20 minutes of riding, he stopped on a rise that looked out over the full width of the valley. Below them, Larkspur was small and clear and real in the winter light. The mountains rose behind it. The creek that ran through the valley's center was mostly frozen, but catching the sun where it ran open in thin, bright lines. Cal sat his horse and looked at the view for a long moment before he spoke. "The morning after you left," he said, "the morning after Dorothy Crane took you away in that wagon, I rode up here." His voice was level in the deliberate way of a voice being held there against some internal pressure. "I stood here and watched the road east. 2 hours. Thinking maybe the wagon would turn around. Maybe she'd change her mind." He stopped. She didn't. Clara said nothing. The wind moved through the frozen grass below them. "I came back every week for the first year," Cal continued. "Every week up here watching that road. Not because I believed you'd come. I stopped believing that after the first month when the letters started coming back with the seals unbroken." He turned to look at her, and on his face was the thing that was always closest to the surface with him, the undefended, unmanaged rawness that was either his greatest vulnerability or his most complete honesty. She had never been able to decide which, and she suspected it was both. "I came here because this was the one place I let myself feel it. Everything I was carrying. Everywhere else I had to function. Had to work the ranch and feed the cattle and keep going. But up here, I let it be what it actually was." "Cal, I'm not asking for sympathy," he said. "I'm asking you to understand who I am. I am not a man who manages what he feels. Never have been. What I feel all the way through. What I felt for 6 years was more than I knew what to do with most days." His jaw worked. "I knew what it would be like sending that letter. Knew Everett and Aldous would do the same. Knew what I was walking into. I sent it anyway because the alternative was silence, and I was done with silence." The valley lay below them, patient and indifferent and beautiful. "I thought about you," she said. "Every day. All three of you. But you specifically, Cal, I used to wonder if you had found someone who could match what you felt. Someone who wouldn't be overwhelmed by it." Something shifted in his face. "Were you overwhelmed?" She considered him carefully. "At 18, yes. I didn't know what to do with a man who felt things that completely. It was too large for me then." She held his gaze steadily. "I'm not 18 anymore." They looked at each other on that ridge with the mountains at their backs and the cold sky above, and the valley spread out below them, and what passed between them in that particular silence was not something either of them had words for, but which both of them understood with complete precision. "Show me your ranch," she said. He did. Cal's operation was the largest in raw acreage built outward from its original structure in the ambitious, slightly ungainly way of a man who had kept expanding his vision faster than he had resources to refine the execution. The barn was genuinely impressive, built over 3 seasons by his own hands, large enough to shelter every animal he owned through the worst winter the territory could produce and still have room for more. The irrigation channel he had dug himself because he'd decided not to wait for anyone to do it for him. The fields that would come up in spring. Then he opened the door to the room he had built 2 years ago. It was set apart from the main living area, not a practical addition or an afterthought, but a room built with a deliberate and specific tenderness that sat in striking contrast to the roughness of everything surrounding it. The bed was well-made quilts, folded with care. Dried wildflowers hung from the ceiling, brittle now, their color faded to pale ghosts of what they had been, but still present, still arranged with an attention that time had not entirely erased. 2 years ago, he said from behind her, I couldn't stand just waiting anymore. I needed something to work toward. So I built this room and I told myself, when she comes back, she'll have somewhere that's hers. It won't be perfect, but it'll be real. Clara stood in the center of the room and looked at the dried flowers and felt something close to grief, not for loss, but for time, for the years it had taken all of them to arrive at this room, this moment, this convergence that should have happened 6 years earlier. You weren't certain I'd come back, she said. No, Cal said, and the honesty of it stopped her in a way a more comfortable answer would not have. I wasn't certain. I was desperate. There is a real difference. He crossed the room and stood before her, close enough that she could see the line of an old scar along his left collarbone, where his shirt collar lay open. She did not yet know that story, but she filed it carefully, understanding it was a story that mattered. I built this room because I needed to believe you would come back, because I couldn't hold a direction without something to aim at. That's the honest truth of it. She looked up at him. He was waiting, not demanding, which was unusual enough from him to notice, just genuinely waiting. And the restraint of it from a man who was not built for restraint told her more about how much this mattered than any declaration could have. I'm here now, she said. You are, he said, very quietly. You are here. He did not kiss her. He looked at her for a long moment, with everything he felt moving openly and without apology across his face, and then he offered her his arm to walk back to the main house, and she took it, and they went back into the February light together. That night, the temperature dropped sharply after sundown, the sudden kind of drop that the mountains produced occasionally, as though delivering a reminder of the actual terms of living in this country, and by morning Clara woke with a heaviness behind her eyes, in a heat in her skin that had nothing to do with the warmth of Lenora's quilt. She tried to stand, the floor tilted. She sat back on the edge of the bed and breathed carefully, and told herself it was the travel and the cold and 6 years of insufficient rest catching up with her at the wrong moment. She told herself this for roughly 10 minutes, at which point Lenora knocked, entered without waiting for an answer, and pressed the back of her hand to Clara's forehead. Spring fever, Lenora said with the brisk efficiency of a woman diagnosing a familiar problem. It's been moving through the boarding house all week. You're the fourth. The men are coming. Are not your concern at present. Lenora was already moving, adjusting the window, checking the water pitcher. You are getting rest and medicine. I'll send word to the ranches. The 60 days are still counting, whether you're upright or flat on your back. Rest, Miss Weston. She sent riders to all 3 ranches with the same brief message: Miss Weston had fallen ill. The courtship visits were postponed until she recovered. Come if you must, but expect nothing from her until she was better. What Lenora had not fully calculated, what she perhaps should have anticipated given everything she knew about these 3 specific men, was that all 3 would come. Immediately. Abandoning whatever they had been doing, mid-task saddling horses with a speed that startled their hired hands riding for Larkspur, as though the note had said something considerably worse than that she was feverish. Everett arrived first. He came through the boarding house door with a controlled urgency that was as close to panic as his nature allowed, his gray-green eyes scanning the room before he had fully cleared the threshold, his arms carrying a leather satchel and a bundle of dried herbs assembled with the organized speed of a man who had been thinking about emergencies for the better part of a decade. Where is she? He said. Upstairs resting, Lenora said, positioning herself between him and the staircase with the calm authority of a woman who had stopped considerably larger men than Everett Cole when the situation called for it. She is not receiving visitors. Leave those herbs on the table and sit down. Everett looked at the staircase. He looked at Lenora. Something moved through his face, the calculation of a man assessing an obstacle, And then he set the herbs on the table and sat, because Lenora Greer was not the kind of obstacle he was willing to make a scene over. Aldous arrived 15 minutes after. He was pale in a way that Clara, had she been conscious and observing, might have found revealing about the precision with which he actually managed his emotions. He carried a basket from the general store, flannel for compresses, peppermint oil for the nausea that high fevers brought, willow bark for the pain, assembled with systematic thoroughness. "How high is the fever?" he asked Lenora before he had properly closed the door behind him. "High enough," she said. "She's resting. You're staying down here." Aldous set his basket beside Everett's herbs. The two men looked at each other with the particular look of men who are in exactly the same situation and know it. Then the front door opened with considerably more force than either of the previous arrivals, and Calhoun Holt came in from the cold with mud on his coat, from riding fast on winter roads, and eyes that were wild in the specific way of a man who had spent 40 minutes on horseback, attempting to convince himself that everything would be fine, and had not succeeded. "Where is she?" he said, louder than the others had. "Upstairs," said Lenora for the third time with increasing authority, "which is where you are not going." "The hell I'm not, Cal." Everett stood, not in threat, just stood, which with Everett Cole was a complete statement. "She is being looked after. Sit down." "I'm not sitting down while she's—" "What precisely are you going to do instead?" Aldous said from across the room, his voice entirely calm. "Charge upstairs and stand over her bed. Sit down, Cal. We are going to be here for some time. There is no value in exhausting ourselves before it matters." Cal looked at both of them, then at the staircase, then back. He sat down. Lenora regarded the three men, the table covered with remedies they had assembled independently and brought without coordination, the expressions on their faces that differed in quality, but not in content. She made a decision. "She needs bone broth," she said. "I have a stove in the kitchen. Can any of you cook?" Cal was on his feet before she finished the sentence. What followed over the next 3 days was not what any of them would have predicted had anyone asked them a month earlier. Cal took over Lenora's kitchen with the focused, channeled intensity that defined him in every undertaking. He had his mother's bone broth recipe committed to memory. She had taught it to him when he was 9 years old, 3 years before she died of a winter fever that the territory's medicine in 1866 had no means to touch. He had never made it for anyone since. The making of it now was something more than practical in a way he could not have articulated and did not try to. He chopped vegetables with a precision that was entirely unlike how he did most things. Carrots, onions, celery diced with a deliberateness that Lenora observed from the doorway. With quiet astonishment, this was not the man she watched move through the world at full speed. He roasted the bones until they were deeply, evenly browned. He covered them with water and set them to simmer, checking and adjusting the heat every half hour, skimming the foam, tasting, correcting. He did not leave the kitchen for 3 hours. When the broth was ready, he carried it upstairs himself and sat beside Clara's bed and offered it to her in careful spoonfuls during the brief intervals when the fever released her enough to swallow. "Just a little more," he said in a voice that was nothing like his usual voice, stripped of its roughness, low and careful, the voice of someone holding something fragile. "Come on now. You need it." She swallowed. Her eyes were fever bright and only partially focused, but she swallowed. Everett took the morning shifts. He arrived before sunrise each day, carrying the leather journal he had filled since the first morning, temperatures recorded at 2-hour intervals, notation of which remedies produced which responses, a running account of her condition that he cross-referenced with the medical text he had borrowed from Aldous' shelves. He had visited Dr. Patterson, the town physician, on the first morning, and had laid his notes across Patterson's kitchen table with the directness of a man who is not there for reassurance. "Tell me if I am missing anything," he said. "Anything at all." Patterson had reviewed the notes for several minutes. "You're doing everything correctly," he said finally. "The fever has to run its course. There are limits to what can be accelerated." "That's not acceptable," Everett said. "It rarely feels acceptable," Patterson said, not without sympathy. "But it is true." Everett returned the next morning with more questions, and the morning after that. He was not a man who accepted the real limits of a situation without first testing every approach to it, and when the limit turned out to be genuine and immovable, he held his position there and did not waste energy pretending the limit was something it was not. On the second morning, when the fever spiked and her breathing became fast and shallow, He held her hand with a grip that was steady and consistent and completely there, not trying to fill the silence with reassurance, simply present, simply refusing to be anywhere else. Aldous read to her. He began with Byron because Byron was what he had read to her in the stolen moments behind the church 6 years ago. And there was a logic to returning to the beginning of things. Then Tennyson. Then Shakespeare's sonnets, which seemed to settle her even when the words were not reaching her, as though the rhythm itself had some independent quality that the fever could not touch. When the poetry was exhausted, he moved to novels. When the novels ran out, he read farming almanacs and seed catalogs and the Larkspur weekly paper in its entirety, including the commercial advertisements for feed and dry goods, because the specific content did not matter. What mattered was the steady, reliable presence of a human voice in the room, something that remained constant regardless of what the fever was doing. On the second night, when Clara cried out and woke, disoriented and frightened, he was beside her immediately. "I am here," he said. "We are all here. You are not alone." She focused on him with effort, her eyes very bright. "Everett," she started. Then her eyes cleared slightly, finding his face. "Aldous." "Here," he said. "Right here." The others. "Everett is making tea downstairs. Cal is sleeping. He has been up since yesterday and needs it." He held her hand firmly. "We are taking shifts, all three of us. We are not going anywhere." Something moved across her feverish face, not quite peace, but the edge of it, the approximation that fever allowed. "Good," she whispered, already sliding back under. "Don't want to choose. Want all of you." He sat very still. The room was quiet except for her breathing, which was steadier now, and the wind at the window and the small night sounds of the boarding house. He sat with what she had said and did not move for a long time. By the third morning, a folded note had been pushed beneath Lenora's front door. Judge Elias Boone's handwriting, 3 lines formal and direct. The nature of Miss Weston's arrangements in Larkspur had come to his attention through parties he did not name. He requested that she present herself for a formal inquiry at her earliest recovery. The matter would require explanation. Lenora read it twice, then she carried it upstairs and set it on the nightstand beside Clara's water glass, where it would be the first thing she saw when she was well enough to see anything clearly. The night of the third day was when the thing happened that none of them had arranged and none of them could have taken back. Cal came up the stairs for his shift at 2 in the morning and found Aldous coming down from his, and they stopped on the narrow staircase in the dark and looked at each other with the particular honesty that exhaustion produces, the stripping away of the competitive posture that had structured their relationship for 6 years. "How is she?" Cal said. "Fever is still elevated. She drank some tea this evening. She was coherent for nearly an hour." Aldous paused. "She asked for you, Cal, called your name in the delirium." Something opened in Cal's expression that he was too tired to close. He sat down heavily on the stair, and Aldous, after a moment, sat beside him, and they were 2 large men in the dark on a narrow staircase, and neither of them found this unreasonable. "She calls for all of us," Aldous said. "Your name, mine, Everett's, sometimes separately, sometimes all 3 in the same breath, as though she cannot separate us anymore, as though we are all of a piece to her in a way that none of us individually is." Cal put his head in his hands. "What are we doing, Aldous?" "Not a question. We have been treating this like a contest for 6 years, like there is a prize to be won, and the winner keeps her. She is not a prize." His voice was rough in the particular way of exhaustion and something older than exhaustion. "She is a person. She is up there sick, and she is calling for 3 different men, and it has not occurred to any of us that there might be a reason for that." "I know," Aldous said. "I have been thinking the same thing. Every hour I sit beside her. So what do we do?" "I don't know precisely, but I know that working alongside you and Everett these past 3 days has felt like nothing I have experienced since coming to this country." He looked at Cal in the darkness. "It has felt right, like something that was supposed to exist but had no name until now." "Brotherhood," Cal said quietly. "Something very like it." They sat in silence. Below, the house was quiet. Above, Clara slept. "There is something I need to tell you," Cal said. "You and Everett both, before this goes further." The pause that followed had the specific weight of something that had been carried for a long time. In the Arizona Territory, 79, the campaign. You were wounded, Aldous said. A bad wound, abdominal. Cal's voice was level, the level of a voice that has practiced delivering a specific thing until the delivery no longer flinches. The Army surgeon was direct with me about it. The damage was extensive. The likelihood of my fathering children is very low. He said probably not possible. Aldous was quiet. She deserves children, Cal said. She deserves a full life, every part of it. I have been telling myself for 3 weeks that I have no right to be here, that a man who cannot give her what she deserves has no business competing for her. A long pause. And then I see her face and I cannot make myself leave. I have tried every morning. I have not succeeded. Aldous was quiet for a long moment. A child belongs to the people who raise it, he said carefully, not solely to the person whose blood it carries. You understand that. I know what I am supposed to think about it. That is different from what I actually believe at 2 in the morning. Cal, Aldous turned to face him in the darkness. If you remove yourself from this, from her, you are not protecting her. You are leaving her. There is a real and significant difference, and she will know which one it is, and it will cost her something she does not have to spare. He held the dark eyes directly. Stay. We will work out the rest as it comes. Everett's voice came from the bottom of the stairs. Neither of them had heard him come in. He was standing in the hallway below, coat still on, having returned from checking on his horses at the livery stable, and he had heard enough. He looked up at both of them on the staircase and said nothing for a moment. Then what he said, his eyes were on Cal specifically. Stay. 3 words, every one of them fully meant. Cal looked at the man below him on the stairs and the man beside him on the stair, and the thing in him that had been wound tight for years, the thing that had needed something to aim at in order to function, eased by a degree that was visible even in the darkness of the hallway. All right, he said. Good, said Everett. Now one of you go sit with, I will make more tea. The fever broke on the afternoon of the 4th day. It went the way fevers go when they finally relent, not as a sudden event, but as a gradual withdrawal, the heat receding in stages, the breathing slowing into something deeper and more regular. The restless movement of the past 3 days settling into real sleep. Lenora came in at 2 in the afternoon, pressed her hand to Clara's forehead, and exhaled slowly. An hour later, Clara opened her eyes. The room came into focus in stages. The familiar quilt, the window in its mountains, the weak afternoon light, and surrounding her bed in the particular arrangement of 3 men who had been taking shifts for 4 days and had somehow in this specific afternoon all arrived in the same room at the same time. Everett, in the chair by the bed, still and watchful. Cal at the window turning the moment he heard her stir. Aldous sitting on the floor with his back against the wall and a book on his knee that he was clearly not reading. You're all here, she said. Her voice was rough, but her eyes were clear, genuinely clear. How could we be anywhere else, Everett said. She looked at each of them, at the exhaustion in their faces, real exhaustion, days of it, the kind that does not come from labor, but from sustained, sleepless worry, at the evidence of 3 men who had stopped competing and become something else. How long, she said. 3 days, Cal said from the window. You stayed the whole time. We worked together, Aldous said, to take care of you. It seemed like the only thing that mattered. Clara felt tears on her face which she had not expected, not from the fever and not from weakness, but from understanding, from looking at what was in front of her and comprehending what it meant. 3 men who had spent 6 years apart from her and 3 weeks as rivals had in 4 days of shared difficulty become something that none of the 4 people in this room had a name for yet. She understood looking at them that they had already answered the question she had been afraid to ask. I need to tell you something, she said, for anything else, for whatever comes next interrupts. She pushed herself upright against the pillows slowly, and none of them moved to help because they could see she needed to do it herself. I have spent 4 weeks presenting this as a process of rational decision-making, of choosing carefully and fairly. She looked at each face and turned steadily. That was not the whole truth. The truth is that I knew from the moment I stepped off that train. I have known for 6 years what I wanted and could not have. The room was completely still. I cannot choose between you, she said, not because I am incapable of making a decision, because the decision I want to make, the only one that is actually true for me, is that I want all three of you. I want what you have been to each other in these 4 days. I want what the four of us could be together." She held each gaze in turn steady and direct. "I know what that means. I know what people will say about it. I know there is no name for what I am asking. But I will not break two hearts to claim one, and I will not pretend to want something smaller than what I actually want, not after everything it cost me to get back here." Silence. Then from outside the window, a sound that none of them had been paying attention to: a carriage. The creak of wheels on the frozen street, the stamp and blow of horses, the precise clipped sounds of someone arriving who had not been expected and had not been invited. Lenore appeared in the doorway with the controlled expression of a woman who has processed difficult news before delivering it so that the recipient does not have to absorb it alone. "There is a woman downstairs," she said, "just arrived by private carriage from Boston. She has a man with her from a Boston law office, and a second man she is calling Miss Weston's intended." Every face in the room changed. "Her name," Lenore said, "is Dorothy Crane. She says she has come to bring her niece home." Clara May Weston had been weak 20 minutes ago. She had been feverish and barely capable of sitting upright. She sat up very straight. "Tell her," Clara said, and her voice did not waver, "that her niece will come down when she is ready, and not a moment before." The three men in the room looked at each other. The thing that had formed between them over 4 days of shared vigil over bone broth and herbal tea and dark staircase conversations, in the particular intimacy of watching someone you love fight their way back from fever held. Everett stood. "You are not going down there alone." "No," said Cal from the window, "you're not." Aldous closed his book with a quiet final sound. "When you are ready," he said, "we go down together." Outside, the February wind moved through Larkspur. Below them, Dorothy Crane waited in Lenora Greer's parlor with her lawyer and her manufactured documents, in 60 days' worth of careful plans built on the absolute certainty that Clara May Weston would never find her way back to this territory, these men, this life. She had been wrong about that. She was about to discover how wrong she had been about everything else. She took 20 minutes. Not from weakness, though she was still genuinely weak. Not from fear, though a younger and less tested version of herself might have recognized what she felt in those 20 minutes as fear and been paralyzed by it. She took 20 minutes because she understood, with the specific clarity that high fever sometimes deposits in a person when it finally releases them, that Dorothy Crane had spent 6 years counting on Clara May Weston to be unprepared for exactly this moment. She intended to be prepared. Lenora helped her dress without being asked, the dark green wool again brushed clean and buttoned straight. She pinned Clara's hair with the quiet efficiency of a woman who understood that the statement a person makes before they speak a single word is sometimes the only statement that carries. "How do I look?" Clara said to the mirror. Lenora looked at her with the direct appraisal of a woman who did not trade in flattery. "Like a woman who owns property," she said. Clara held that thought like a coin in her fist and went downstairs. Dorothy Crane had not changed in 6 years in any way that immediately registered, and then Clara looked more carefully and saw that she had. She was older. The lines at the corners of her mouth had deepened. The gray in her hair was more pronounced beneath the traveling hat. But the presentation was identical. The black dress, the straight spine, the composed and faintly pitying expression of a woman who had spent decades arranging things to her advantage, and had arrived at the genuine conviction that the arrangement was for everyone's benefit. She stood in the center of Lenora's parlor with two men flanking her. One was narrow-shouldered in a city lawyer's coat, carrying a leather document case with the grip of a man who understood that the documents inside were his only leverage in an unfamiliar room. The other was Gerald Morrow, prosperous-looking, somewhere in his middle 40s, wearing the expression of a man who had accepted terms and was now standing in the room where those terms were being questioned and was beginning to reassess his options. Everett stood against the far wall with his arms crossed. Cal was at the window. Aldous had positioned himself near the small writing desk in a way that appeared casual and was not casual at all. He was 6 feet from the document case, and he was watching it with the focused attention of a man who intends to read its contents at the first available opportunity. Dorothy looked at Clara when she entered, then at the three men ranged behind her. Something shifted behind the composed exterior, a rapid recalculation. "Eleanor," she said. She had always called her Eleanor. Clara had not gone by Eleanor since she was 12 years old, and had asked her father directly and with the seriousness of a 12-year-old who has decided something to please call her Clara instead. Dorothy, Clara said. She did not sit. She stood in the center of the room, equidistant from the door, and from her aunt, and the three men behind her were not a wall to hide behind, but a foundation to stand on. And the difference between those two things was the difference between 6 years ago and now. You look unwell, Dorothy said. You should be resting. This is precisely the kind of situation I was concerned about. You are clearly not in a condition to be managing. This is Mr. Victor Hale. Dorothy continued, gesturing toward the lawyer, who nodded with the mechanical precision of a man performing competence. He represents my interests regarding your father's estate. And this is Mr. Gerald Morrow of Boston, to whom you are engaged. Clara looked at Gerald Morrow for a long moment. He looked back at her with the expression of a man experienced enough to recognize when he is in the wrong room and pragmatic enough to be calculating his exit. I don't know you, Clara said. Eleanor now. My name is Clara. She said it without heat, without performance. Just facts stated with the quiet finality of something that has been decided for a long time. You have called me Eleanor for 24 years because it suited you. It does not suit me. My name is Clara. She looked at Morrow again. I have never met this man. I have never corresponded with this man. I have never agreed to any arrangement with this man. Whatever document your lawyer is carrying that bears my signature, that signature is not mine. Dorothy's composure did not crack. It was, Clara acknowledged privately, a genuinely impressive performance from a woman who had spent decades practicing it. You have been confused, Dorothy said. You have been confused for years, Eleanor Clara. This territory, these men, this romantic notion of returning to a place you idealized as a child, it has affected your judgment. I am here because you need someone to help you see clearly. You are here, Clara said, because the railroad contract has 60 days left on it, and you need me out of Colorado before I understand what I own. The room went very quiet. Dorothy looked at her for a sustained moment. That land requires experienced management. You have no. The land belongs to me, Clara said. I would like to know with precision by what legal authority you have been managing it for 6 years and negotiating its sale without my knowledge or my consent. She looked to her right. Aldous. Aldous moved from the writing desk to Clara's side with the calm deliberateness of a man who has prepared his argument and is ready to deliver it. He held a sheet of notes in his hand, points organized in the orderly way of someone who had spent 3 years learning how arguments were structured and won before he came west to learn how winters were survived. Mrs. Crane, he said, addressing Dorothy with the formal courtesy that was in his hands, considerably more cutting than any rudeness could have been. Your guardianship of Miss Weston's affairs was predicated on her status as a minor following her father's death in 1877. That guardianship became legally inoperative in 1880 when Miss Weston reached the age of legal majority. Any actions taken regarding the Weston land holdings subsequent to that date without Miss Weston's explicit and documented consent constitute unauthorized management of another person's property. He paused. At minimum, possibly rather more than that under territorial law. Hale, the lawyer, stirred. The arrangements were made in good faith and in the interest of good faith, Cal said from the window, in a tone that left no ambiguity about his assessment, is a considerable claim for a woman who returned 40 letters without opening one of them. The quality of the silence that followed was different from the silence before it. Dorothy turned her composed gaze toward Cal with the specific disdain she reserved for men she had decided were beneath her consideration. I beg your 43, Everett said from the wall. His voice was the voice he had used as a marshal, the voice that had the ability to stop a man mid-action and make him think carefully about the next several seconds of his life. 43 letters returned. I kept the envelopes, every one of them for 6 years in a box in the back room of my ranch house. He looked at Dorothy with gray-green eyes that contained no hostility, no forgiveness, and nothing at all except the flat and immovable certainty of a man who has evidence and knows precisely what it is worth. 43 letters sent, 43 returned unopened, and you told her no one wrote. Dorothy's composure showed its seams for the first time. I made decisions that were in her best interest. You made decisions, Clara said, that were in your best interest. You have been making them for 6 years, and I have been living inside the consequences of them. That is finished now. The confrontation with Dorothy that afternoon was the opening of a door. The closing of it would require something more, something with the weight of law behind it, something that could not be contested or reframed or outlasted by a determined woman with city lawyers and manufactured documents. Judge Elias Boone gave them 48 hours. He arrived at the boarding house that same evening after Dorothy and Hale had installed themselves at the town's only hotel, and Gerald Morrow had quietly and with minimal ceremony reconsidered the terms of his involvement and arranged transport east, which surprised no one present. Judge Boone was 60 years old, deliberate in everything, and possessed of the specific patience of a man who had heard a great many versions of the truth over a long career and had learned to identify the one that held together under sustained pressure. He looked at the situation with the detachment of a professional and gave his assessment without editorial. The documents Dorothy had produced required examination. Clara had the right to contest them. He would hold a formal proceeding in 2 days. If Clara could produce evidence that Dorothy's authority was fraudulent, he would act on it. If she could not, the question of the land and of her status would need to be resolved by other means. 48 hours, three men looked at each other. For the first time since Clara had arrived in Larkspur, they were not rivals. They were a team with a problem and a deadline, and the problem was solvable if they moved. Everett used his former marshal's standing to access the county land records, requesting official review of the Weston property filings in the chain of documentation going back to Thomas Weston's original title. His badge was hung up, but 8 years of service did not disappear from a man's reputation, and the county clerk opened the files without resistance. Aldous read every document Dorothy had brought carefully twice and identified the specific technical flaws in each, not just the forged signature on the engagement agreement, which was visible to anyone who looked closely, but the procedural defects in the guardianship documentation itself, the specific provisions that had not been followed, the records that should exist and did not. Cal rode through the night. He left Larkspur at 10 in the evening on the best horse in his stable and rode to the neighboring county to an address that Aldous had extracted from his correspondence with the Denver clerk, an address that corresponded to a man named Thaddeus Birch, a name that Aldous had found referenced obliquely in a county record from 1876. He knocked on the door of a farmhouse at 4 in the morning and told the man who answered without preamble that there was a woman in Larkspur who needed him and that the matter would not wait for business hours. Thaddeus Birch was 71 years old. He had practiced law in Colorado Territory since before it had that designation, and he had survived 2 mining camp legal disputes, one range war arbitration in the winter of 1875, with the deliberate economy of a man who had learned that survival was primarily a matter of not wasting energy on things that could not be changed. He was small and weathered and unhurried, and when Cal explained the situation at 4 in the morning in a farmhouse doorway, he listened completely and then said, "Give me 10 minutes to dress." He arrived in Larkspur beside Cal at dawn on horseback, which was remarkable for a man of 71, and which he declined to discuss. He carried a document case that was older than most of the buildings in Larkspur and considerably better maintained. He asked to see Clara alone first. They sat in Lenora's back room at the small table Lenora used for her accounts, and Thaddeus Birch opened his document case and looked at Clara with eyes that were sharp and tired and genuinely kind, the eyes of a man who has kept a promise for 7 years and is glad to finally be able to deliver on it. "Your father came to me in the spring of 1876, he said. He was not a well man at that point, though I believe he hoped he might be wrong about that. He folded his hands on the table. He was very clear about what he wanted and very clear about why he wanted it arranged the way he arranged it. He said to me, 'My wife's sister is a practical woman, and practical women make dangerous guardians. I want my daughter protected from practicality.'" Clara felt the tears before she had decided to feel them. "He left you the land," Birch said, 342 acres clear, title no conditions of any kind attached to marriage or to age or to any other circumstance whatsoever. Your father did not trust conditional arrangements. He said, Birch paused, consulting his notes because he had written it down, because he had thought it worth preserving. He said, "Eleanor knows what she wants. She has always known. I only want to make certain the world cannot take it from her before she is large enough to hold it." Clara pressed her hand against her mouth. The guardianship that Dorothy Crane exercised was based on a document that I did not draft and did not sanction, Birch continued. I have made inquiries going back several years. That document was produced in Boston using your father's signature sourced from earlier private correspondence. In other words, it was not legitimate. He placed a document on the table between them. This is the actual will. Witnessed registered in my office, held by me for 7 years at your father's specific request because he did not trust the county records to be beyond Dorothy Crane's influence. Clara looked at her father's handwriting on the signature line. She knew that handwriting had grown up with it had received letters in it when he traveled and wrote home. Below the legal language at the very bottom of the document, below the witnesses' signatures and the registration notation, her father had added a line that was not standard legal text, a single line in his careful hand. Eleanor, I knew I would not last long enough. The land is yours. The men who love you will find you again. Trust them. Trust yourself. I always did. She read it twice, then she folded it carefully along its existing crease and held it in both hands for a moment, feeling the paper's weight. Then she put it in the pocket of her dress against her chest. Mr. Birch, she said, her voice was steady, I would like you to accompany me to Judge Boone's proceeding this afternoon. Miss Weston, said Thaddeus Birch, that is precisely why I rode through the night. The hearing was held in the largest room in the Larkspur courthouse, which was not large, a low-ceilinged space with 6 rows of benches that served for town meetings and legal proceedings, and the occasional gathering when weather made the outdoors inadvisable. On this particular afternoon, it was full to the walls. News moved through small frontier towns with a thoroughness and speed that no city newspaper could match. The people of Larkspur had heard about the Boston woman with the lawyer. They had heard about the engagement document and the land dispute, and the fever and the 3 ranchers who had been waiting 6 years. They had heard about all of it, in fact, with a level of detail that would have surprised most of the participants in the story. The result was a full room and a collective attention of the specific quality that a small community directs at a situation that is both scandalous and genuinely consequential. Judge Elias Boone regarded the assembled room with the equanimity of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by how many people showed up for other people's troubles. This is a legal proceeding, he said to the room in general. It will be conducted as one. Anyone here for entertainment is welcome to leave now. No one left. Dorothy sat to the left with Victor Hale beside her. Gerald Morrow was, as previously established, no longer present. To the right sat Clara with Thaddeus Birch on one side and Aldous on the other. Behind her, Everett and Cal occupied the first row of benches close enough that she could have reached back and touched either of them. Hale went first. He was a competent lawyer working with flawed materials, and he chose speed over depth, presenting Dorothy's position with clean efficiency, the guardianship arrangement, the land management, the railroad negotiations, as responsible stewardship of an asset on behalf of a ward who had shown no interest in returning to manage it. He was halfway through the engagement agreement when Thaddeus Birch said mildly and without any particular emphasis, "That will not be necessary, counselor." Hale stopped. Birch rose. He was small and unhurried, and he placed Thomas Weston's will on the table in front of Judge Boone with the care of a man delivering something that has been kept safely for 7 years and is now going exactly where it was always intended to go. He laid out the document. He explained the date of its creation. He explained the chain of custody, his office, his registry, his personal possession for 7 years at the testator's explicit request. He explained why Thomas Weston had chosen private registration, and he explained it simply and without embellishment because the explanation was simple and required none. Thomas Weston had not trusted the county records office to be beyond Dorothy Crane's reach. Then he placed Dorothy's guardianship document beside the genuine will. The signature on this document, he said to Judge Boone directly, was sourced from private correspondence. I have in my possession 3 letters written by Thomas Weston to myself and to 2 business associates in 1875 and 1876. I am prepared to produce them for examination by any qualified analyst this court cares to engage. The formation of specific letters, the capital W in Weston, the lowercase e, is inconsistent with the signature on Mrs. Crane's document in ways that are not subtle or open to interpretation. He paused. It is not Thomas Weston's signature, Your Honor. It is an approximation of it sourced from correspondence and reproduced by a hand other than his. The room produced a sound that Judge Boone silenced with a single look. Hale was on his feet. He made 3 arguments in rapid sequence, each one slightly less structurally sound than the one before it. The quality of a man working through the materials available to him and discovering as he goes that each one is less useful than he had counted on. Dorothy sat beside him with the composure that had been her most reliable weapon for 6 decades and which was now visibly and for the first time developing fissures. Judge Boone listened to all of it with the patience of a man who is committed to hearing everything before deciding anything. He asked 2 questions of Birch. Both were answered without hesitation and with specific reference to documents. He looked at the papers for a long time. Then Everett Cole stood up. He did not ask permission or clear his throat or make any of the preliminary gestures of a man seeking acknowledgement. He stood in the way a man stands when he has decided something, and Judge Boone, who had known Everett for 8 years, who had personally accepted his badge when Everett chose to hang it up and had done so with the private regret of losing his most effective officer, looked at him and waited. "Judge," Everett said, his voice carried to the back wall without effort. "I wore a badge in this territory for 8 years. You know my record. In those 8 years, I kept the law in 4 counties because I believed the law was worth keeping. I still believe that." He paused. "This land belongs to Clara Weston. That is what the law says, and the law is right. The documents in front of you are clear. I am asking you to affirm what the law already says." He sat down. The room was very quiet. Then from the back bench, a woman stood. She was past 50 with white-streaked hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades working outdoors in a territory that rewarded endurance and nothing else. Mabel Granger had come to Colorado Territory in 1859 alongside her husband, had outlasted him in 2 brutal decades and 1 range war, and had built a cattle operation in the northern part of the county that was by any honest measurement the most successful in the region. She was not a woman who spoke in public often. When she did, the room listened without needing to be asked. "Judge Boone," she said, "I have been in this territory for 24 years. I have watched it become something from nothing, and the best of what it has become has come from people who were willing to build things that did not have established names yet." She looked at Clara and then at the 3 men, and her expression was not sentimental. It was the expression of a person assessing a situation and finding the structural elements sound. This woman came back to land her father left her. She has 3 men who have been working this land in this community for years who want to help her keep it and build something with her. I have no objection to what they are building, and I suspect the law has no legitimate objection either. She sat down. Judge Boone was quiet for a long time. The room waited. "The will of Thomas Weston, as presented by Mr. Thaddeus Birch," he said, "is entered into the record of this court as the binding and controlling document regarding the disposition of all Weston land holdings. The guardianship arrangement presented by counsel for Mrs. Crane is found to be without legal foundation, its foundational document being fraudulent." He looked at Dorothy without animosity and without warmth. "Mrs. Crane is ordered to cease immediately all negotiation or representation regarding the Weston property. She is to present herself to this court tomorrow morning to address the matter of the railroad correspondence and any related financial transactions." He paused. "Furthermore," he continued, "any contractual negotiations entered into by Mrs. Crane regarding the Weston land holdings after the year 1880, when Miss Weston reached legal majority, are hereby declared void and without legal standing. The Denver and Rio Grande Railroad will be formally notified of this ruling by this court. They have no enforceable claim." He looked at Clara. "Miss Weston, the land is yours. It has always been yours since the day your father registered that document with Mr. Birch. Everything done with it, without your knowledge or consent, is subject to full review, and you will have the complete assistance of this court in that process." Another pause, and in it something that was not quite warmth but was adjacent to it in the way that a man like Judge Boone allowed himself to express what he actually thought. "Welcome home." Dorothy left without speaking to Clara. She crossed the room after the proceeding with the rigid deliberateness of a woman who has decided that the preservation of dignity is the last available objective and intends to achieve it. She walked past Clara without stopping, without looking at her, without the accounting or the confrontation that Clara had in various forms over 6 years imagined. She walked through the door and out into the February cold and was gone. Clara watched her go. She had prepared for this moment, had spent time in the boarding house in Boston on the long train west in the narrow bed at Lenore's during the fever, imagining what she might need to say or feel when it arrived. She had thought this moment would feel like more than it did. It felt like a door closing. Not with drama, not with the crash of something collapsing, just the quiet final sound of a door pulled shut on a room that no longer had anything in it worth going back for. Dorothy Crane had made choices over 6 years, and those choices had cost Clara 6 years that she would not get back. That was true and would remain as true. But standing in the doorway of the Larkspur courthouse with three men coming toward her, and the certain knowledge that her father's land was her land, Clara found that she did not need an accounting. She did not need Dorothy to understand what those 6 years had cost. She needed what was ahead of her. She let the door close and turned to face forward. They were married on a Thursday. The legal ceremony was brief and simple, held in the small Larkspur church in the late afternoon with winter light coming through the west window, amber and long and gentle, the particular light that February in Colorado produced on clear days, as though offering an apology for everything else the month required. Clara wore the dark green wool dress for the third time. Everett wore his good coat and his cleanest boots and looked throughout the ceremony like a man exercising the most significant restraint of his life in the service of something he wanted more than anything he had ever wanted. Cal and Aldous stood as witnesses dressed in their best straight-backed and still in the way of men who have made a decision they are inhabiting fully and without reservation. Between them in the small intervals of the ceremony, something passed a glance here, a steadied breath. There, the small movements of two men who were holding each other together through something that was genuinely difficult and genuinely unambiguously right at the same time. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Everett kissed her, Clara felt Cal's hands go still at his sides, and Aldous looked briefly at the ceiling of the church, and she loved them both in that moment, specifically and completely, for what it cost them, and for the fact that they bore it without flinching, and without asking her to pretend it was something other than what it was. Afterwards, they walked together to the land. Thomas Weston's 342 acres lay 4 miles east of Larkspur, where the valley opened and deepened, and the soil was the dark, rich kind that rewarded what you put into it. Clara had not stood on this land since she was 18 years old, and walking it now in the late afternoon with the four of them moving through the dormant winter grass, she felt the specific sensation of a place that has been waiting for you, that holds the shape of your absence and is glad to have it filled. The foundation was already there. The three men had poured it during the 4 days Clara was ill, had worked in shifts through the cold, mixing and setting and leveling with the focused efficiency of people doing something necessary, something that could not be postponed. It was not large, it was not elaborate. It was a foundation for a house that would be central to all four of their lives, positioned as nearly equidistant as the land allowed from the three existing ranch houses. And it was solid in the way of things built by people who mean what they are building to last. Clara stood on it and felt the weight of the stone beneath her boots. There was no minister for this ceremony. There did not need to be. Everett spoke first. He stood before Clara on the foundation stones with the mountains behind him and the late sun full on his face, and said what he had to say. In the direct and unembellished way, he said everything that mattered. I promise to be the ground beneath you, the constant thing, the one who shows up every morning and does not stop and does not leave through whatever the seasons bring. He paused, and there was something in the pause, not uncertainty, but the weight of complete sincerity. I have been practicing that for 6 years already. I intend to continue for the rest of my life. Cal went next. He could not stand completely still. It was not how he was built. But when he spoke, the words came from a place that had nothing performative about it. I promise to be the fire in this, the intensity and the passion, and the thing that keeps life from going quiet and small. I will love you in a way that leaves no room for doubt, and I will feel everything completely, and I will not apologize for it, because it is who I am. His eyes held hers. I promise to let that be a strength instead of a weight. I have been working on that. I am better at it than I was. Aldous was last. He was calm in the way he was always calm, not because the depth of what he felt was less, but because he had learned in a different country and a different life to hold large things with steady hands. I promise to be your equal, he said, in thought and in conversation and in everything that a person needs another person to match them in. I left England because I could not breathe inside the life I was expected to inhabit. I came to this country to build something I had chosen. He paused. I cannot imagine anything more worth choosing than this. Clara looked at each of them in turn. At the gray-green eyes, in the dark eyes, in the hazel eyes, the faces she had been carrying in her memory for 6 years, real now and present, and asking nothing of her except what she had already decided to give. I promise to be honest, she said, with each of you, every day. I understand what this costs, and I know that it will keep costing, and I am not asking any of you to find it easy. She stopped and looked at all three of them together. I am asking you to find it worth it. I believe that it will be. Lenora Greer, who had ridden out with them and was standing at the edge of the foundation with her hands folded in front of her, produced 4 plain silver rings from the pocket of her coat. They had been made at the town silversmiths on Clara's commission, simple bands engraved on the inside face with 2 words, by choice. They put them on each other's hands on the foundation of a house that had not yet grown its walls on land, that had been held in trust by a dead man's love for his daughter, in the presence of a west wind that moved through the valley and bent the winter grass and carried the cold, clean smell of the mountains across everything. The house took 8 months to build. All 3 men gave what hours they could spare from their own operations, and those operations were by now coordinated more closely than any of them had initially planned, sharing equipment, sharing labor in the heavy seasons, sharing the particular accumulated knowledge of this specific land that each of them had developed in years of working it. 3 separate bodies of knowledge combined turned out to be more effective than any one of them operating alone, which none of them said aloud because it did not need to be said. The jealousy did not disappear. Clara had not expected it to, and had told them clearly in the first weeks that she did not want them to pretend that it had. Pretending was a luxury of comfortable circumstances, and their circumstances were not comfortable in that particular way. The jealousy came in waves, sharp and genuine, and occasionally disorienting, the specific pain of loving something too much for sharing to feel natural. Cal had the hardest time with it, which surprised no one, including Cal. He was built for completeness in the way some men are built for it, and the daily practice of expanding himself to accommodate something less than everything was genuinely difficult work. He was honest about it, was sometimes brutally honest about it, in ways that required patience from the others, and slowly, with the grinding, incremental progress of any genuine change, he became something larger than he had been. Not different, not less himself, larger. Everett's difficulties were quieter, which made them easier to miss if you were not paying the specific kind of attention that Clara paid to him. She learned to watch for the mornings when his journal entries were more detailed than the information warranted, when the work at his ranch extended well past sunset, in the way that meant he was attempting to exhaust something that could not be exhausted by physical labor. On those mornings, she found reasons to be at his ranch, and he did not say anything about why she had come, and she did not say anything about why she had come, and the simply being there was enough. Aldous retreated behind books when he was hurting, which was a manageable pattern, until it became invisible, at which point Clara had learned to simply sit beside him in the silence until he was ready to come back. He always came back. That was the particular quality of Aldous Wyndham he processed slowly and thoroughly and privately, and when he returned from wherever he went inside himself, he returned with something specific and useful to say that was worth the wait. The Sunday dinners were where the real maintenance happened, the weekly honest accounting of what they were each carrying, the airing of grievances and small jealousies and genuine concerns that Lenora had suggested in the first month, and which had become the indispensable ritual of their shared life. They were uncomfortable sometimes those Sunday evenings around the long table in Clara's kitchen. They were honest in the way that things are honest when comfort has been explicitly set aside as a priority. They held them without exception in every season, regardless of what the week had contained. This was what held it together. Not the easy days took care of themselves. It was the Sunday evenings that built the thing that lasted. Spring came to the valley in April of the second year with the extravagance that Colorado spring produced. After a hard winter, sudden and green and almost aggressively alive, the creek running high and clear, the fields coming up with a speed that made the months of frost feel like something you had imagined. The Weston operation had weathered its second winter as a unit and had in the process fed 3 neighboring families through a stretch when the cold had killed cattle they could not afford to lose. That act, unremarked upon by its givers, unremarked upon publicly by its recipients, but understood by everyone in Larkspur who had eyes, had shifted the general tenor of the community's regard for the household more effectively than any explanation or argument could have. The valley respected usefulness. The Westons were useful. Clara's daughter arrived in that same April, in the same spirit of spring. The labor was 14 hours, which the midwife, a practical woman named Harriet, who had delivered more than half the children in the county, and had no patience for either panic or sentiment during the process described as entirely typical, while Clara experienced it as something considerably more than that. All 3 men were present throughout, which Harriet had objected to once and had not objected to again, after seeing that their presence sorted itself in a way that was actually useful rather than obstructive. Everett held her hand through the worst of it, grip, steady and consistent and never varying, never rushing, just there. He did not try to fill the hours with words. He understood that the most useful thing he could offer was exactly what he offered, the certainty of his presence, unwavering and complete. Cal could not be still. He paced the room in a pattern that became so regular. Harriet eventually directed him to the hallway, where he paced the hallway until Aldous appeared with a chair and told him with the patient authority of a man who has made his decision and is not interested in debating it to sit down before he wore a groove in the floorboards. Aldous talked Clara through the breathing. He had read 3 medical texts on the subject, had constructed a system that was more organized than anything Harriet had offered from experience, and which Harriet had after the 3rd hour grudgingly acknowledged was effective. Clara had clung to Aldous' voice in the worst hours, like a rope thrown into deep water, not to the words exactly, but to the steadiness of them, to the evidence that someone was thinking clearly when she could not. When the baby came at last at 3 in the morning into the lamplight, in the cold spring air, in the exhausted silence of a room that had been waiting for hours, Harriet placed her in Clara's arms, and the sound the child made, that first sudden furious claim on breath and air and existence, moved through every person in the room, and through the walls and out into the spring night. Clara held her daughter and looked up. The 3 men were crowded into the doorway together, Everett's jaw working with the effort of containing something he did not have words for. Cal with his hand pressed flat against his mouth. Aldous with his eyes bright in a way that he would describe later when pressed as the effect of the lamp at a difficult angle which no one believed. "Come in," Claire said. "Come and meet her." They came. They stood around the bed, 3 men who had built ranches from raw land and survived things that left marks, and waited 6 years for a woman who had been worth every day of the waiting. And they looked at the child in Clara's arms with expressions that none of them could have described, and that anyone watching would have understood completely and without need of explanation. "What is her name?" Aldous asked. His voice was not quite steady. Clara looked at her daughter, at the dark hair and the small, insistent fists and the eyes that were the unfocused blue-gray of every new thing that has not yet decided what it will be. "Hope," she said. Cal made a sound that he covered badly. Everett reached out one large and very careful hand and touched the baby's head with a tenderness that was from him as complete a declaration as any words he had ever said. Aldous looked at Clara over the baby's head with everything he felt moving in his face unguarded, in the way he rarely permitted, and that meant more precisely because he so rarely permitted it. "Well," he said very quietly in the voice he used when he was moved past the point where composure served any purpose. "Welcome to Colorado, little one." 2 years later, on a morning in April when the high peaks still carried their winter white and the valley below them was entirely green, Clara stood on her father's land and held a child on each hip. Hope, 2 years old and possessed of an energy that made standing still purely theoretical for her, was already squirming to be put down and allowed to pursue some objective, visible only to herself. James Thomas, 3 months old, regarded the mountains with the philosophical indifference of the recently born and was interested primarily in being warm. 3 plumes of smoke rose from 3 separate chimneys across the valley. The 3 ranch houses still operating, still individual, still the homes that 3 men returned to and left from, and returned to again on the rhythm they had worked out across 2 years of honest negotiation about what worked and what did not, and what was worth the difficulty. The central house behind Clara was solid and warm, and had become over 2 years something that reflected all four of them. Aldous' shelves running along one wall added to steadily by Clara's own deliberate book-buying the large table in the kitchen that had witnessed more Sunday evening conversations than she could count, the wide porch that faced the mountains and that she had spent more mornings on than she could calculate, watching the light change on the snow. Larkspur had not arrived at comfort with the Weston household. Clara had never expected comfort, had only asked from the beginning for the basic regard extended to people who worked hard and kept their word and contributed when contribution was needed. Most of Larkspur had extended it. The ones who had not had discovered over 2 years that sustained disapproval, directed at a family that included a former U.S. Marshal and two men who had proven their capacity for endurance in different theaters, was less effective than they had hoped. The winter feeding of three neighboring families had done more for the household standing than any argument or explanation could have. The valley respected what was useful and what could be relied upon, and the Weston operation had established itself as both. From the rise to the east she heard horses, two of them coming from the direction of Cal's ranch. The two-horse sound that had become over 2 years the sound of Cal and Everett riding together in the mornings when the work at their respective places was lighter. They had not been friends in any conventional sense 6 years ago. They had been something more complicated than that, the specific and wary respect of capable men who have been each other's most consistent competition. They were something else now, something that also lacked a clean name but that was more real and more useful than most things that do have names. Cal dismounted first and came directly to Clara with the practiced ease of a man who had been taking James Thomas from her arms since the day the boy was born, who had held him in hands that had built enormous things and survived terrible things, and had been shaking with relief when he had spooned bone broth into a feverish woman's mouth 2 years ago. James Thomas looked at Cal with the serious expression of someone engaged in important assessment. "Still doesn't look like any of us," Cal observed. "He looks like himself," Clara said. "Give him time." Everett came and picketed both horses with the unhurried efficiency that characterized everything he did, then came to stand beside them on the rise with the valley spread below and the smoke rising from the three chimneys of a life built from something that had no name and no precedent and no guarantee. "Aldous is coming for dinner," Everett said. "I know, he sent word yesterday." Clara shifted Hope to her other hip, receiving in return a small fistful of her hair, which Hope released upon request. "He finished the north fence line. He should have asked for help with that. He didn't ask. He never does. Neither do you." A beat. Then from Everett, the thing that had become across 2 years, a reliable and particular gift, the almost smile that was his version of a laugh, the expression that meant he had been caught, being exactly himself and did not mind. Cal was looking at the valley, at the three plumes of smoke in the green fields and the creek catching the morning light in bright, moving lines. "My father used to say," Cal said to himself as much as anyone, "that a man's land tells you everything about him, whether he cares about what comes after him, whether he's building something or just using something up." "Her father's land," Everett said with a look at Clara. "Our land," Clara said. She said it the way she said things that were completely simply true, without weight or emphasis, in the same voice she had said, "I remember everything on a cold platform 2 years ago." The simplicity of it was what made it real. Hope reached up and took another handful of her mother's hair, her standard method of demanding attention, and Clara untwisted the small fingers and held the small hand and looked out at the valley that her father had loved and worked and trusted her to hold. The wind came down from the mountains the way it always came, cold and clean and indifferent to everything that was not the simple fact of the land and the people standing on it. The same wind that had come through Larkspur on the morning she had stepped off the train with a carpet bag and 6 years of a life that had been too small for what she was. The same mountains, the same enormous sky. She had come back to this place not knowing if what she had imagined would be real, or if the 3 years had made her remember everything larger than it had been, or if the men would have changed beyond recognition, or if there would be anything left of what had been left behind. She had come back anyway because the alternative was staying in a life that was not hers, and she had stopped being willing to do that. She had found it real. She had found it larger than she had remembered, in fact more complicated, more difficult, more costly in ways she had not fully anticipated, and more worth it than she had allowed herself to hope. Every difficult Sunday evening, Every winter morning, every small and ordinary day of a life she had chosen with full knowledge of what it required. Worth it, or all of it. Hope laughed at something visible only to herself, the sudden complete laugh of a child who has not yet been taught to moderate joy for the comfort of others, and the sound went out across the valley and the fields and the cold morning air, and kept going. Way sounds carry an open country farther than you expect into more of the world than you can see. Clara held her daughter and stood on her father's land and looked forward. The mountains stood where they had always stood. The valley held its shape. The three plumes of smoke rose from the chimneys of a life she had built on her own terms on land her father had kept faith with her across death to preserve with people she had refused to give up or lie about or settle for less than. There was nothing behind her worth turning back for. Only this. Only here. Only forward into the life she had chosen on the ground she had come home to with the people she had fought to keep. Only home.